There is a moment, and most men never find it, because most men never sit still long enough, when the wild world stops pretending it doesn't see you. I've ridden through 40 years of canyon country. I've slept under skies so black and thick with stars they looked like spilled salt on a dark table. I've watched flash floods swallow ravines whole, seen elk stand still as painted wood in morning fog, heard coyotes mourn things I couldn't name. I thought I understood the grammar of wild places. I thought I knew the punctuation, what a silence meant, what a shifted wind meant, what a bird suddenly going quiet meant. I did not know anything. Not until the night Declan Rourke lay dying in a one-room adobe house at the edge of the Sacramento mountains, and something came down out of the dark to say goodbye to him. Something that had no reason to, something that defied every category I had learned. Something that sat at the edge of firelight and breathed slow and looked at a broken old man with eyes that held no hunger. I wrote it in my log. I date everything, habit from a surveying job I held for 3 years in my 20s, the only truly disciplined season of my life. I wrote it down in small, careful letters because the hand shakes when the mind can't hold what it has witnessed, and small, careful letters slow the shaking. August 4th, 1887. Sacramento foothills, clear sky, no wind. The Panther came at dusk and stayed until the man stopped breathing. The cowboy who watched didn't run. Neither did the cat. I don't know which of them I was more afraid of. What happened next, what the cowboy did when the Panther finally rose, when the moment balanced on a knife edge between the human world and something older and stranger, I have told only twice in my life. Once to my wife, who held my hand and didn't speak for a long time afterward. Once to a mescalero man named Tomas who listened, nodded slowly, and said only, "Some deaths get witnessed right." I'm going to tell it a third time now, all of it, in the order it happened, as close to true as human language gets. Sit down, this will take a while. Some things deserve the full telling. I came to Declan Rourke's place because his daughter asked me to, and because I owed her father a debt that had accumulated interest over 20 years. That's the simple answer. The full answer takes longer and involves a card game in Las Cruces in 1866, a broken hand, a lie I told to a sheriff, and Declan Rourke standing between me and a very bad outcome with nothing but a flat stare and a reputation I'd never have built for myself. He didn't ask for anything in return. He never brought it up. That was the kind of man he was, the kind who does a thing and then acts as though the thing never happened. So you spend the rest of your life carrying it quietly while he carries nothing. His daughter Bridget found me in Chilarosa in late July. I was doing odd work for a feed merchant, mostly counting sacks and writing inventory in a ledger, which suited my surveying instincts better than my dignity. Bridget Rourke, Bridget Castellano now, married 3 years and living north of the territory, had ridden 6 hours to find me. She had her father's flat stare and her mother's red hair, and she was not a woman who wasted words. "He won't come off the land," she said. "The doctor in Alamogordo says he has maybe 3 weeks. He won't come to town, won't come south with me, won't do anything except sit on that porch and watch the mountains. I need someone to stay with him who he won't chase off." "He'll chase me off," I said. "He might," she said. "But he'll feel bad about it after, and that might slow him down." That was almost funny. I almost smiled. "How bad is he?" She looked at her hands. She had her father's economy of gesture, everything precise, nothing wasted. "His lungs," she said, "started 2 winters ago. He's been managing, but last month he stopped managing." I packed a bag that evening. 1 change of clothes, my survey log, 2 pencils, a pocket knife, and a small jar of the liniment I'd been making since my niece started complaining about stairs. The ledger was habit. I've kept field logs since I was 22, not diaries. I want to be clear about that. Diaries are for feelings. Field logs are for facts. I note what I observe. Distances, elevations, weather, the particulars of terrain. It just so happens that sometimes the terrain includes people, and sometimes the people are worth noting down. The Rourke homestead was 14 miles northeast of Chilarosa, riding into the foothills. I knew the road, or what passed for a road, mostly a suggestion worn into the scrub by 30 years of wagon wheels and Declan's mule. The land was high desert merging into mountain base, the kind of country where yucca and pinon shared the same slope, and the air smelled like dust and pine pitch mixed in roughly equal measure. I'd surveyed land adjacent to his parcel back in 1871. I remembered the property as remote and deliberately so. Declan had chosen the edge of things on purpose. He was not a man who found comfort in proximity. He was on the porch when I arrived, sitting in a chair that had been repaired so many times it was more repair than original chair, a blanket across his legs despite the heat, and a tin cup on the rail beside him. He was watching the mountains. He did not look at me when I rode up. He let me dismount, tie my horse, and walk to the steps before he spoke. "Bridget sent you," he said. "She found me. I came on my own steam." Generous interpretation. He finally looked at me. His face had changed, not crumbled, not collapsed the way sick men's faces sometimes do, but distilled. Like something had burned away everything unnecessary and left only the essential Declan, which turned out to be approximately 70% stubbornness and 30% something quieter and harder to name. His eyes were still clear. "That surprised me. You look older," he said. "You look worse." He almost smiled. "Get your horse settled and come eat something. I've got stew on." That was the whole reunion. 20 years, a debt, 6 hours of riding, and we talked about stew. The next 2 days established the pattern of things. Declan rose before dawn. This surprised me. I'd expected a sick man to sleep long and irregular, to have surrendered the rhythms of the well. But he was up before light, moving slowly and with what I can only describe as deliberate economy, as if he'd calculated exactly how much movement he had left and was budgeting carefully. He made coffee. He sat on the porch. He watched the mountains turn from black to purple to the particular amber of early desert light. He did not want to be helped with this. I learned that on the first morning when I came out to sit with him, and he looked at me with an expression so specifically unenthusiastic that I took my coffee back inside and logged 3 pages of observations about the color of the sky until I heard him go back in. We negotiated this without speaking. By the second day, I understood the schedule. He had the dawn. The porch, the mountains, the light, that was his time, and it was not shared. I could have the kitchen during those hours, or I could walk. I walked mostly. Old surveyor's habit. I took notes on the terrain, which I did not need for any practical reason, but which settled something in my chest. What I noted on those morning walks was that the land around Rourke's homestead was wilder than I'd remembered. Or perhaps it had always been wild and I'd been too young to read the signs properly. There were tracks in the soft mud along the small creek northeast of the house, big cats, I was fairly certain. Mountain lion prints I'd seen before, these were larger, rounder, broader through the pad. The spacing suggested a heavy animal. I noted this in my log with a surveyor's precision. Front left track, approximate width 4.5 inches. Stride length roughly 28 inches on flat ground. Weight, considerable. Species, unknown. I didn't mention the tracks to Declan. I didn't know why exactly. The information seemed like it should wait for something. On the second evening, Declan let me sit with him on the porch after supper. We watched the dark come in from the east, which is the direction dark always comes from in that country. You can see it moving, a slow purple tide that rises from the flatlands and doesn't reach the mountain peaks until much later. The mountains hold the light longer. I've always thought that was something worth noting. We talked a little. Not about health, not about the debt, not about the years between. He asked about my surveying work, where I'd been, what land I'd covered. I told him about the Jornada del Muerto surveys, about a week I'd spent in the Organ Mountains in '79 when a storm pinned me for 4 days, and I'd had nothing to do but watch water drip from limestone and make increasingly detailed maps of a 10-foot section of canyon wall. He listened the way he'd always listened. Complete attention, no interruptions. The specific quality of silence that makes you feel heard without making you feel observed. Then he said, "Something's been coming down from the upper ridge. Nights mostly, past 2 weeks." I kept my voice neutral. "What kind of something?" "Big cat," he looked at his coffee cup. "Not a lion, I've seen lions up here, this is something else." I thought of the tracks, the pad width, the heavy stride. "You sure?" "I'm sure of what I see," he said. "My lungs are failing, my eyes are fine." There was a silence. An owl called from somewhere in the pinyons to the south. Declan didn't look afraid, but he looked something. There was a quality to his stillness that I didn't have a word for yet. Not peace exactly. Not resignation. Something in between or beside those things, occupying a category I didn't have labeled. "It stays on the ridge?" I asked. "Mostly," he paused. "Last night it came closer, to the edge of the yard." He nodded toward the dark outline of a juniper at the property's edge. Sat there for a while, looking. "Looking at what?" He glanced at me sideways. In the dark, with the lamplight spilling yellow from the doorway behind us, his face was half lit and half shadow, which somehow suited him. "At me," he said, "I believe. I have a quirk. I mention the logs, but there's more to it. When I am disturbed by something, when something sits in my chest that I cannot account for by normal logic, I write it out in bullet points. Not prose, not reflection. Just the facts as discrete items, lined up on the page, as if order itself is a comfort when comprehension fails." I underlined unable to specify why. Then I closed the log and tried to sleep. The third day was a hard day. Declan's lungs were worse in the morning. I could hear it from the next room, a thick, wet sound to his breathing that hadn't been there the day before. He came to the kitchen anyway, made his coffee anyway, went to the porch anyway. I watched from the doorway. He moved like a man crossing a room that kept getting longer, each step requiring a small interior negotiation, but he made it. He sat. He watched the mountains. I brought fresh water. I made a second pot of coffee. I did not hover because hovering was a category of behavior he would have treated as an act of aggression. I found things to do inside. There was a bridle that needed mending, and I have adequate hand skills with leather, and it kept me within earshot without being present. At mid-morning, he called me out. I came to the porch. He was looking northeast toward the ridge. His hands were wrapped around his cup, and the knuckles were white, which I noted and which troubled me, because everything else about him in those 3 days had been so deliberate, so contained, and white knuckles are a thing that happens below deliberation. "Tell me what you think," he said, not looking at me, looking at the ridge. "About the cat?" "About any of it." He paused. His breathing was audible even in the open air. "About why a creature with no reason to be near a man keeps coming back to be near one." I thought about my bullet points. I thought about the pad width in the mud. I thought about what I knew of big cats, which was observational rather than deep. What I'd seen in the wild. What I'd read in the naturalist pamphlets I collected because they were cheap and dense with specific detail. "I don't know," I said. "Animals behave in ways we can't always account for." "That's not what I'm asking." I looked at him, the white knuckles, the ridge, the sound of his breathing. "You're asking what it means." "I'm asking what you think it means." This was a different kind of question. Declan Rourke, in all the years I'd known him, not many years, but weighted years, had never asked me for interpretation. He dealt in facts and did his own interpreting. The fact that he was asking now told me something about where he was, not in terms of his lungs. In terms of something else, something the lungs were merely the occasion for. I sat down on the step below him. I looked at the ridge. "My mother's people were Irish," I said. "County Clare. She used to tell stories about things that came to watch the dying, not to harm them, just to witness. She called it a kind of courtesy, the old world paying its respects before someone left it." Declan was quiet. "I don't know if I believe that," I said, "but I think about the tracks I've seen. The spacing, the weight of the animal, something that size up in those rocks has been here a long time, knows this land better than either of us, has watched men come and go." Another silence. The wind moved through the piñons and brought the smell of pine resin and something else, something musky and deep that I hadn't noticed before but was suddenly very aware of. "I'm not afraid of it," Declan said. "No," I said, "I didn't think you were." "I'm not afraid of any of it." He finally looked at me. His eyes were red around the edges, not from emotion, or not only from emotion, from the effort of breathing, from the body's continuous labor of it. "I'm tired," he said. "That's different." "Yes," I said, "it is." He looked back at the ridge. After a long while he said, "I'd like to see it properly, not from a distance." His voice was even, factual, the voice he used for things that were decided rather than things that were being decided. "Before the end." I wrote that down later, exactly as he said it. The handwriting is steadier than I expected, given what I was feeling. "I'd like to see it, properly, not from a distance." Before the end. I did not sleep on the third night. I sat at the kitchen table with my log open, and I listened to the land. The Sacramento mountains at night are not quiet, not the way cities are not quiet, with their human noise layered over silence, but with their own active life. Insects cycling through their rhythms, a breeze that moved through different elevations at different times and made the piñon sound like distant water, the occasional cry of something hunting or something hunted, which often sounds the same. I wrote through the first watch. I stopped writing around the hour before midnight and just listened. The insects stopped at 20 past midnight. I know because I had my watch open on the table. One moment, full insect sound, the whole chorus of the August night. The next, silence, total and immediate, as though someone had closed a door. I looked at the watch. I looked at the open doorway to the porch. I looked at my log. I wrote 0023. Insects ceased. Then I picked up my log and my pencil, and I walked, as quietly as I could, to the porch. Declan was not in his room. He was in his chair on the porch, wrapped in his blanket, sitting completely still. He had known. Somehow he had known, and had come out before I heard anything, before the insects stopped, before. There was a moment of feeling, standing in that doorway, that I had arrived late to something that had already been unfolding, that I was catching the middle of a sentence whose beginning I'd missed. The Panther was at the edge of the yard. Black, not the abstract black of a dark night, but a specific, physical, textured black, the black of something present and breathing and real. It was large. My God, it was large. In the moonlight, I could see the shift of its muscles as it breathed, the slight flicker of its tail. Its eyes were amber, and they were not looking at me. They were looking at Declan. Declan was looking back. Neither of them moved for what my watch, later, told me was 11 minutes, though it felt like something outside of time entirely, something that occupied its own category separate from minutes and hours. I stood in the doorway. My pencil was in my hand. I did not write. I did not breathe loudly. I did not move because moving felt like an interruption of something I had no standing to interrupt, something occurring between two parties and involving only them. At the end of 11 minutes, Declan raised his right hand. Slowly, the gesture of someone who knows the grammar of stillness and is choosing words with great care. He raised his hand, palm out, toward the Panther, not a wave, not a signal, something closer to an acknowledgement. I see you, I am seen. The Panther's tail moved once, a slow, full sweep. Then it turned and walked back into the dark at the base of the ridge, and the insects began again, all at once, as though a door had reopened. Declan put his hand down. He sat looking at the place where the Panther had been. Well, he said after a while, his voice was rough with effort and something that wasn't quite emotion but was right beside it. There you are, then. I didn't know if he was talking to me or to the space the Panther had left. I didn't ask. I want to be precise about August 4th, because precision is how I have always managed the things I cannot control, and August 4th was a day I could not control from the first hour. It began with the stove. The small iron stove in Declan's kitchen had a crack in the firebox that I'd noticed the day I arrived. I'd been meaning to fix it with clay and ash, a temporary solution I'd used on similar stoves in other rough country postings. I rose at 5 o'clock before Declan was moving and mixed the clay. The repair was simple. The act of fixing something with my hands at 5 in the morning, while the sky went from black to the first suggestion of gray, was not simple. It was essential, the same way writing in the log was essential. Something to do with my hands while my mind worked through what had happened in the yard. 11 minutes, a raised hand. Well, there you are then. I mixed my clay. I applied it carefully to the crack. I let it set near the heat of the warming stove. I wrote in my log, August 4 repaired firebox, hands steady enough. Then Declan came to the kitchen, and I heard his breathing immediately, and the hands were less steady. It was worse, perceptibly, measurably worse, not the slow gradient I'd been watching over 3 days, which had been a deterioration you could argue with yourself about, attribute to variables, tell yourself was plateau rather than decline. This was the next stage. I'd heard it once before, in a man dying of the same thing, a fellow surveyor I'd bunked with for a field season in '74. I recognized the quality of it, the way each breath required the whole body's participation, the slight bluish tinge around the lips, the way he sat down at the table with a careful deliberateness that was no longer economy of motion, but the management of pain. He looked at the firebox. Fixed it, he said. Seemed like the thing to do. He nodded. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup I'd put in front of him. The hands shook, and he let them shake, which told me more than anything else about where the day was going. Declan Rourke had been containing his hands' tremors for 3 days. Letting them shake meant the containment budget was being spent elsewhere. Write something down for me, he said. I opened my log. Ready. He was quiet for a moment, gathering something. "The deed to the east pasture is in the box under the bed. In Bridget's name. Has been for 2 years. Tell her she doesn't need to file anything. The Doña Ana county clerk has a copy with a notary seal." I wrote it. "The mule is Arisley's, Arisley Benavides at the ranch east of Chilarosa. She raised him from a foal and she sold him to me when she needed money and she should have him back." He paused, breathing. "He'd be glad to go back, I think. He always looked east." I wrote it. "The Winchester in the left cabinet belongs to Tomas Silkwater. He left it here 3 years ago, and I kept meaning to get it back to him and didn't. I wrote this too, and I noted the name because I would meet Tomas Silkwater before this was over. I did not know that yet. The Navajo blanket on the bed, that stays on the bed. Whoever gets this place next, and I suppose that's Bridget, and I suppose she'll sell it. Whoever is in this house, they should have a blanket on the bed." I didn't write that one immediately. I sat with it for a moment. "Write it down," he said. I wrote it down. The morning was hard in the way that mornings become hard when they are the last real morning of something. When you are inside the final hours of a thing. And the final hours are made of very ordinary objects and very ordinary light. And the ordinariness of everything is itself a weight. I made breakfast. Declan ate a small amount slowly with the concentration of a man for whom eating has become a technical problem rather than a pleasure. I ate too, though I couldn't have told you afterward what I ate. Outside, the Sacramento mountains were doing their dawn performance, amber light flooding down from the peaks, shadows pulling back into the canyons, a red-tailed hawk making long circles above the ridge to the northeast. Declan watched the hawk. "He's been working that ridge for 6 years, he said. "The hawk, or his children, hard to tell the generations from below." I looked at the hawk. It banked, caught a thermal, rose another 50 feet. "You've been watching that ridge for 6 years. 31, he said. "I've been here 31 years. The ridge has been here considerably longer." He said this without wistfulness or regret. It was a fact. He was noting a fact. I wrote it in my log, 31 years. He has been watching this ridge for 31 years. Around 9 o'clock, he asked me to bring his chair outside. Not the porch chair, a different one, heavier, that normally sat beside the fireplace inside. He wanted it at the edge of the yard, facing northeast, facing the ridge. I moved the chair. I helped him walk to it, because this time he accepted the help without discussion, which was its own information. I put a blanket across his legs. He was sweating slightly despite the morning cool, which was another piece of information, and his lips had more blue in them than an hour before. And I noted all of this in my log with the flat, careful notation of a man who cannot afford to feel things in real time, and so pays them to the page for later collection. "The cat comes at dusk mostly," I said, "if it comes at all." "It'll come," he said. There was no uncertainty in his voice. This was not wishful thinking. I knew what wishful thinking sounded like in old men who wanted things, the particular uplift in the voice, the slight hesitation that betrays hope by trying to conceal itself. This was something else. This was the flat statement of a man who had been in this land for 31 years and had learned to read it the way I read my survey instruments, with precision and without sentiment. I did not argue. I took my log and I sat on the ground nearby with my back against the juniper fence post, and I began writing about the hawk. There was a man who came at noon. I heard the horse before I saw the rider. The land has a particular acoustic quality, sound carrying far in the thin, dry air, and I noted the hoofbeats in my log at 11:51 before I could identify their source. He came from the south, on a dun horse, moving at a walk that suggested he'd been riding long and was in no hurry for the last portion. He was mescalero, older than me, younger than Declan, perhaps 50, with the kind of face that the desert makes when it works on a person over decades, all the soft parts burned down to something essential and angular. He was dressed practically, plain work clothes, no ceremony, though he had a small beaded band around his hat that was the only ornament on him. He rode up to the edge of the yard and stopped, and he looked at Declan, and something passed between them that was not a greeting exactly, but contained all the information that greetings are supposed to carry. "Tomas," Declan said. Declan, a pause, "You look like hell." "I feel like hell," Declan said. "Get down." This was Tomas Silkwater, the man whose Winchester was in Declan's cabinet. He dismounted with the ease of someone who has been riding since before he had formed opinions about riding, unconsciously, without performance. He tied his horse to the fence post above where I was sitting and looked down at me. "This is Everett Crane," Declan said. "He's a good man, keeps notes about everything." "I see that," Tomas said, looking at my open log. "The Winchester's inside," Declan said. "Left cabinet." "I didn't come for the Winchester," Tomas said. He looked at Declan. "Heard about the cat." I looked at Declan. Declan's expression showed, for one unguarded half-second, something that might have been surprise, and then it closed back to its default. "How?" "Bautista's wife saw tracks near there well 3 days ago. She mentioned them to her cousin. The cousin mentioned to my nephew that the tracks were heading northeast, toward Rourke's land." He paused. "Your land talks, old man. It has for 30 years. "What did you hear about the cat?" Declan said. Tomas looked at the ridge. "That it's not a lion, that it's something that hasn't been in this range in a long time." He took off his hat. "That it came down to someone's yard and sat there." The silence that followed was the kind that'd wait. I wrote nothing. My pencil was in my hand, but I wrote nothing. Declan said, "It looked at me last night." "I know," Tomas said. "You know what that means?" Not a question. Tomas was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the ridge, at the place where the panther had been, at the compressed dry grass that might have held, if you looked closely enough, the impression of something that had sat there. "I know what my grandfather would have said about it," he said finally. "I know what the old stories say." "What do the old stories say?" Tomas looked at him. "That some things come to be with the ones they respect at the end, that it's a recognition." He paused. "That you don't get visited like that unless you've lived in a way that the land notices." Declan made a sound that was not quite a laugh, more like an acknowledgement of something he'd already considered and come to his own terms with. "I've been hard on this land plenty of times," he said. "I'm not a saint." "Nobody's a saint," Tomas said. "Saints don't get noticed the way real things get noticed." I wrote that down. I had to. Saints don't get noticed the way real things get noticed. I didn't know yet what I'd do with it. Sometimes you write a thing because it's true and true things need to be written, and you figure out the context later. The three of us spent the afternoon in the yard. Tomas did most of the talking, stories mostly. 30 years of shared history with Declan, compressed and selected, the stories that two men choose to tell when they both know there's a limited supply of afternoons left. I mostly listened, or I pretended to. I was also watching Declan's breathing, and I was watching the ridge, and I was writing, in the small, cramped notation that my hand falls into when I'm trying to capture a great deal of information quickly, the way the light moved across the mountain face. There was a story about a fence dispute in 1869 that seemed, in the telling, to be mostly about stubbornness and principle, and the specific comedy of two men who were both right and both wrong, insisting on their rightness at each other for 3 seasons before a late summer flood solved the problem by eliminating the fence entirely. There was a story about a winter in 1872 when a blizzard came through the Sacramento range, and 3 families were snowed in across 3 different homesteads, and people were moving between properties on snowshoes, trading food and company and the particular currency of shared misery that sometimes builds things that outlast the trouble. There was a story about Declan's wife Kathleen that Tomas told with great care and looking at the ridge and not at Declan, and which Declan listened to with his eyes closed and his hands still in his lap, and which I will not reproduce here because some stories belong entirely to the people who lived them. At 4 o'clock Declan fell asleep in his chair, not the collapse of sudden unconsciousness, a slow letting go, like a window being lowered. His breathing did not change, which was a mercy and also an alarm. When breathing stops being the thing that wakes you up, it means the body has assigned it to automatic management and is using its remaining attention elsewhere. Tomas looked at me. "How long?" he said quietly. "I don't know. The breathing changed this morning." He nodded. He looked at the sleeping man and then at the ridge. "It'll come before dark," he said, "at dusk." He said the same thing. "He knows this land," Tomas said. "He knows what lives in it better than most men who have studied it formally." He glanced at my log. "No offense." "None taken," I said. "He knows it the way you know the grammar of a language you grew up in. I know it the way a man knows the grammar of a language he studied from books." Tomas considered this. "That's an honest thing to say." "I try to be honest in my log." He looked at the cover of the log, plain brown leather, worn at the corners, my initials pressed into it from a stamp I'd bought in Santa Fe in 1872. "What will you do with it?" he said. "Write what happens," I said. "That's all I know how to do." He looked at the ridge. "Write it well," he said. Declan woke at 5 o'clock, when the light began its first shift toward gold. He woke completely and immediately without confusion, another thing I noted, because a man at that stage of lung failure waking that cleanly suggested that wherever the rest of him was going, his mind had decided to remain present for the end. He looked at the ridge. He looked at Tomas. He looked at me. "It'll come at dusk," he said. "We know," I said. He adjusted the blanket on his legs. His hands were steadier than the morning, which was not because he was better. I knew enough to know he was not better. But because the body sometimes makes one last accommodation, deploys its reserves for the final effort, the way a lamp burns brightest just before the oil runs out. "I want you both to stay," he said, "but you stay back over there." He nodded toward the fence line. "Give me the yard." "Declan," I started. "Give me the yard," he said again, the flat voice, the decided voice. Tomas put his hand briefly on my arm. "Let it be." I let it be. We went to the fence line. We stood there, Tomas and I, with the long August dusk beginning and the mountains turning from amber to copper to the first traces of rose. And Declan sat in his chair at the edge of the yard with his blanket across his legs and his face toward the northeast. He looked so small out there. I wrote that down later in private where no one would see it and interpret it as anything other than a fact of observation. A man in a chair at the edge of a yard, and behind him the whole long reach of land he'd built his life on, and in front of him the mountains he'd watched for 31 years. He looked so small. And simultaneously, and I've never been able to explain how both things were true at once, but they were, he looked exactly the right size. Exactly as large as a man is supposed to be in relation to the land he's loved. The insects began slowing down at 6:41. I had my watch. I know the minute because I looked at my watch when I heard the first sound, not a sound of approach, no cracking branch or shifting stone, but the sound of attention altering. The air changed. The quality of the silence went from absence to presence, the way a room changes when someone you haven't seen walks into it. It came from the northeast corner of the yard, from the dark at the base of the ridge where the piñons crowded close and the last of the light didn't reach. It came without hurry. It moved the way it had moved the night before. Not stalking, not the compressed fluid movement of a predator with purpose, but a walking, a slow and deliberate walk, as though it understood that hurry was the wrong grammar for this moment. It was larger than I had understood from the night before. In daylight's last remnants I could see it clearly. A black panther of a size I had no reference for, the kind of animal whose existence you know intellectually but whose reality, in person, recalibrates something in you permanently. Not fear, or not only fear. Something older than fear. Something that recognizes in the bones that you are in the presence of something that was here before you and will be here after. Something that belongs to a different order of duration entirely. It walked to the center of the yard. It sat. Its eyes went to Declan, and they stayed there. Tomas made no sound beside me. I did not look at him. I kept my eyes on the yard, and I kept my pencil in my hand, though I did not write. Writing would have taken my eyes off the scene, and I could not take my eyes off the scene because I understood, without anyone telling me, that I was watching something that was going to require accurate accounting, that the precise notation I'd spent my professional life developing was the exact tool needed here, that this moment was a document being created, and I was its clerk. Declan looked at the Panther. The Panther looked at Declan. Tomas breathed slowly beside me. I could hear him breathing, and I was glad of it. The sound of a human being beside me, steady and present, while in the center of the yard, a man and an animal held a conversation that was occurring entirely in stillness. Declan's right hand moved first. He raised it the same gesture as the night before, slow and deliberate, palm out. "I see you. I am seen." But then, and this was the part that I wrote in my log in 3 different ways before I felt I'd got close to what I saw, he did something additional. He turned his palm upward. Open. The gesture you make when you are offering something, or when you are showing that you hold nothing. The gesture of the empty hand. The Panther's ears moved. Both ears forward, oriented precisely toward Declan, the movement of an animal attending with its full capacity. Its tail swept once slowly and stopped. Then Declan began to lower himself from the chair. I moved. Instinct, I stepped forward from the fence line, half a step, and Tomas caught my arm. Not a grab, not a restraint. A hand on my arm, gentle and completely firm, and I stopped. Declan was lowering himself from the chair to the ground. It was not graceful. It was laborious and costly. I could see the effort in every line of his body, the shoulder dropping first, the blanket sliding, one hand on the chair arm and then releasing it, the long, careful transit downward. His breathing, even from 30 feet, was audible. The expenditure of it, the price being paid. He got himself to the ground. He sat in the dirt of his yard in front of his chair, with his legs extended in front of him and his back not quite straight, the back of a man whose body has stopped performing straightness, because there is nothing left to perform for. He put both hands flat on the ground. He stayed like that. I understood then what he was doing. It came over me the way understanding sometimes does, not as thought, but as something more physical, something that moves through the chest. He was putting himself at the animal's level. He was removing the height of the chair, the suggestion of dominance, the human elevation above the ground. He was meeting it where it was. He was not performing humility. Declan Rourke was not capable of performing anything by that point in the afternoon. Every calorie of effort was going to the mechanical business of surviving until the end of the scene. He was doing a thing that cost him genuinely, and that he had decided, with the full clarity of a man who has nothing left to pretend with, was the right thing to do. The Panther rose. It walked toward him, slowly, each step placed with the precision of something that has never moved carelessly in its life. It crossed the yard in the August dusk, past the place where the grass grew longer at the water seep, past the edge of where Declan had set fence posts in the first year, past the center of 31 years of a life built in this exact piece of ground. It stopped 4 feet from Declan. They looked at each other. I had stopped breathing. I became aware of this factually, the way I become aware of things in my log, noted, recorded, not yet fully felt. I was not breathing. Tomas, beside me, was breathing for both of us, slow and even, the breath of someone who was holding the world's pace by will. Declan said something. I could not hear the words. His lips moved. I could see them move from 30 feet away, the specific movement of a few words spoken quietly, the kind of volume you use when you are speaking to something close that does not need volume in order to hear. I don't know what he said. I wrote that in my log in 2 places. I do not know what he said. I underlined it both times, because not knowing is data too, and I was not going to fill it in with what I wished I'd heard. The Panther bent its head. This is the part that my pencil hesitated on. Both times I've written it, not because I doubt what I saw, but because the language for it is inadequate, and I am a man who works in language and knows when language is failing. The Panther bent its head. It moved its enormous black head downward slowly, until its nose, that broad, flat nose at the center of a face built for a purpose entirely unlike mine, touched the crown of Declan's head. 1 second, 2. Then it raised its head and stepped back. And Declan made a sound. I cannot write the sound in any notation I possess. It was not a cry, not a sob, not the involuntary sound of pain. It was something below or beside those categories. Something that I have thought about in the years since and can only describe by saying. It was the sound of a man putting something down that he had been carrying for a very long time, and the putting down was a relief and a grief and a completion, all at once, and none of those words are right, but together they gesture at the vicinity of what I heard. Tomas made a sound too, quiet, almost inaudible, a word in his own language that I didn't catch and didn't ask about later. It wasn't mine to ask about. The Panther stepped back, 1 step, then 2. It turned its body, not its head. Its head stayed oriented toward Declan for a long breath after its body had begun to move away. Then it turned fully and walked back the way it had come, into the dark at the base of the ridge, and was gone. The insects began again. Declan sat in the dirt of his yard with his hands flat on the ground and his head slightly bowed. And he was breathing, and he was alive. And the evening was doing what evenings do, proceeding without ceremony toward full dark. I did something then. I am aware, in the retrospective accounting of it, that I did not think about doing it. I did not calculate. I did not consult my log or my training or my accumulated surveyor's habit of deliberate observation before action. I moved because something in me moved, and the rest of me followed. I walked into the yard. I crossed the 30 feet from the fence line to where Declan was sitting in the dirt, and I sat down on the ground next to him. Not behind him, not beside him at a respectful survey distance. Next to him. Shoulder to shoulder, both of us on the ground of his yard, both of us facing the ridge where the Panther had disappeared. I heard Tomas cross the yard and sit on Declan's other side. The three of us sat on the ground and looked at the ridge as the dark came in. Declan was breathing in the particular way he'd been breathing all day, that labored, whole-body breath that was the sound of a machine running on its last reserves. But he was breathing. He was present. The bluish tinge around his lips had, for the moment, receded slightly, as if the body had made one final accommodation, borrowed one last hour from somewhere. Nobody spoke for a long time. Long enough for the first stars to appear, which at that altitude comes early in August and comes quickly. The sky goes from dark blue to something deeper, and the stars appear not gradually but in sudden populations, as though they had been waiting just above visibility for the signal. Declan said, "I need to write some things." "Tell me," I said, "I'll write them." He did. More of the practical inventory of a life, a debt he owed to a man in El Paso. A small matter involving a water right on the north fence, a book he'd borrowed from the schoolteacher in Chilarosa in 1881 and never returned, and which the schoolteacher should have back. I wrote all of it. My handwriting in the log from those entries is the worst in the book, not from shaking, but from sitting on the ground in the dark, writing by feel more than sight, and from the fact of what I was writing, which was the last inventory of a man's obligations, the settling of accounts before departure. At one point, Declan stopped dictating and said nothing for a long time. I waited. "She was a better person than me," he said finally. "Kathleen, his wife, dead 9 years. I want that on record somewhere." "On record," I said and wrote it. He was quiet again. "The cat," he said. "What do you think that was?" I looked at the ridge. I thought about what I'd seen, the raised hand, the lowering to the ground, the contact, the sound Declan had made. I thought about my mother's County Clare stories. I thought about Tomas's word for it, recognition. "I think you lived here for 31 years, I said. "I think you lived in a way the land noticed, and I think the land sent something to say." I stopped. I tried again. "To say that it noticed." Declan was quiet. "I think," I said, "that you have been a good steward of something that matters, and I think that counts. I think the universe has a way of keeping that kind of account, and tonight you got to see the balance." Another long silence. The stars had fully arrived, the whole summer sky open above us, the Milky Way a broad smear that you could only see that clearly from country this dark and this high. "You're a sentimental man for a surveyor," Declan said. "I measure everything," I said. "That's not the same as being unsentimental." He made the sound that was his version of a laugh. "No," he said, "I suppose it isn't." Tomas helped me get Declan inside at 9 o'clock. He was beyond walking on his own by then. The last reserves had been spent. The borrowed hour returned. And what was left was very small and very fragile and very precious in the way that the last of a thing is always precious. We got him to his bed, the Navajo blanket, the window open because he wanted air. Tomas sat in the chair by the wall. I sat on the floor by the door, my log open on my knee. I was going to write every minute of what came. I owe Declan Rourke a debt, and this was the last form it could take, accurate witnessing. The full and honest accounting of a man's last night. I wrote about the stars I could see through the window. I wrote about the sound of his breathing. I wrote about the way Tomas sat, completely still, the way the mescalero man in the stories sits, as if stillness is not absence of movement but a positive state, a thing you are doing rather than a thing you are failing to do. I wrote about the moment around midnight when Declan's hand moved on the blanket, the way fingers trace something in sleep, or near sleep, or whatever that state was, following a line of thought or memory made tactile, mapping something with the tips of the fingers. I wrote about the sound the wind made coming off the mountains after 2 o'clock. A low, continuous sound, not the intermittent breath of the evening wind, but something steadier, something the mountains were producing with more intention. I wrote that the breathing changed at 3:11. I wrote that it stopped at 3:22. I wrote the specific quality of the silence that followed. which was like the silence after the insects stopped, but total and permanent, and which the stars outside the window continued through without interruption, because that is what the stars do. At 3:23 I closed my log. I sat with it closed on my knee for a while. Tomas said something in a low voice, a phrase in his own language, quiet and without performance, directed at the bed and at whatever had been in it and was no longer there in the same form. I looked at the Navajo blanket. I looked at the window and the stars. I looked at my closed log. Then I opened it. I wrote Declan Rourke, August 4, 1887, 3:22 in the morning. 31 years in this land. I wrote the panther came and the panther left. The man came and the man left. The stars did not comment. I wrote he put his hands flat on the ground of his own yard. I have been taking careful notes for 20 years. That is the most important thing I have ever recorded. I stayed for 3 more days for practical reasons, contacting Bridget, managing the initial matters of the estate, returning the Winchester to Tomas, who took it without ceremony and thanked me for writing things down, which he said was a good and necessary thing. On the morning of the 4th day, I saddled my horse and made ready to leave. I went to the yard before I left. Just the yard, the chair still sitting where we'd moved it, the flattened grass where Declan had sat on the ground, the long reach of view toward the ridge. I stood there for a while. Surveyor's habit. You look at a place before you leave it, you orient yourself, you note what is notable. I looked at the ridge. I looked at the place at the edge of the yard where the panther had first appeared, and then at the place in the center of the yard where it had sat, and then at the place where it had stopped, 4 feet from Declan, and touched its nose to his silver head. I looked at the flattened grass where Declan had put his hands flat on the earth. I got down on my knees. I put my own hands flat on the ground. The dirt was dry and warm already, though it was early morning. The grass was sparse and tough, the kind that survives altitude and heat and thin soil because it has decided to, because survival is not always a matter of conditions, but sometimes of disposition. I could feel the granularity of the soil against my palms. I could feel the faint, barely there tremor of the earth, which exists always, and which most people never feel because most people are not still enough or close enough to feel it. I held that for a moment. Then I stood up, brushed off my knees, retrieved my log from my jacket pocket. I wrote one final entry from that place, standing in Declan Rourke's yard, looking at the Sacramento mountains going gold in the morning light. August 8, 1887, departing Rourke homestead. The ridge is quiet, the hawk is not visible. The grass holds the shape of a man who sat here, and the shape of something that came to be with him. I have surveyed many parcels of land in New Mexico territory. I have measured distances, elevations, water rights, property lines, the exact legal boundaries of what belongs to whom. I could not tell you where the boundary is between the wild world and the human one. I have looked for it carefully, and I cannot find it. I am beginning to think it does not exist. I rode south toward Chilarosa. I did not look back at the ridge. I did not need to. Some things you write down once and carry forever, and they are heavier and lighter than you expected, both at the same time, which is the nature of the things that matter. My log has 47 more entries after that one. Other lands, other surveys, other people met and noted and quietly wondered at. But that entry, August 8, 1887, departing Rourke homestead, I have never written anything after it in that particular log. It felt finished. It felt like the last word of something complete.